Marci Nielsen, who really will be hopefully kicking us off and leading the conversation. I've read your bio and read some of your blog posts, and it's just a wealth of knowledge and policy experts. I'm really excited to have you, Marci, and hope I can pass it off to you to kick us off, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Just moments before I got on this call, I Googled Trump and mental health to see what would come up. And I came across a stat article where a therapist was actually talking a lot about how all of the patients that she was seeing really had a lot to process with her. And one of the recommendations that one of her patients had for her was to hold a cat. And so I must tell you, I have my little cat sitting on my lap. I tried to get her off, but if you see a little black tail, that would be her. And the second thing I would tell you is one of the greatest joys and blessings in my life is I have a therapist that I deeply love, and I got to see her this week. Some of you may know Harriet Lerner, who
Whoa.
right.
Wow, that's your therapist?
Right. She practices in Lawrence, Kansas, and I lived in Lawrence, Kansas for about 20 years. So I do feel like I'm connected to all of you, both from a policy perspective, and I'm happy to walk you through kind of what's happening, as well as from the very realistic perspective that many of us and our patients may be having, which is sort of surprise, awe, fear, despondency, all of those things. And so I want you to know that as light as I may be trying to keep parts of this conversation, just so that we can all get through it together, for many of us, this trifecta, as I'm about to walk you through in terms of the Senate, the House, and the president all going Republican, I want to keep in mind the very serious nature of this conversation and how much many folks are very frightened at this point in time. So maybe I'll just hop you through kind of a few key points about this election. As I'd mentioned to Neftali, I've given this description of the election for a couple of different audiences now, and really want to try to keep this to just a few minutes so that we can open this up and really have a community conversation. So first and foremost, I would want you to know that this was a big surprise to Democratic pollsters, to Republican pollsters. Most folks did not anticipate that there would be a Republican sweep or a GOP sweep, if you will, in the House, in the Senate, in the White House. And what that means is that President-elect Trump's ambitious agenda is very likely to have a lot of energy behind it, at least initially. And that's sort of hard for us in the mental health space to know exactly what that means. But I'm sure many of you heard throughout the election about a thing called Project 2025. Although Trump distanced himself some from Project 2025, it really is sort of a helpful roadmap because many of Trump's transition team members were authors on Project 2025. It's 920 pages, about half of which I've read. So if you have very specific areas that you're curious about that aren't being covered by the media, I'd encourage you to go to Project 2025. The title is Mandate for Change. And I'm going to try to not jump into sort of Washington, D.C. insider talk too much, but the presidential transition has been thus far fascinating to watch, not only because there are some surprising candidates that Trump is moving into or nominating for leadership positions, cabinet positions, but also the Trump transition team has not been willing to sign the mandatory paperwork that's necessary to create a smooth transition. So you may be hearing about some of the conflict of interest policies that Trump isn't willing to sign. And so from a very technical perspective, there's a lot that folks are in fact worried about. Big picture, and I'm sure you all of you are well familiar with this, which is sort of Trump's more broad agenda. He has promised to carry out the country's largest ever deportation operation, to extend tax breaks that he passed during his first term. He's been very clear about his willingness and wish to punish his political enemies. He's very interested in shrinking the size of the federal government, as well as to ensure that the federal government bureaucracy is more in line with what he wants as the president than what the bureaucracy sort of guardrails, we like to call them, that protect civil servants from having to follow too closely in the footsteps of political leadership. Happy to talk to you more about that. But because there is this trifecta, the Senate going, it had previously been Democrat controlled, now Republican controlled. The House with the small majority Republican. The White House, of course, not only winning the 7 battleground states, but also winning the popular vote. And then the Supreme Court last court session declaring that what the president did in his official capacity would be considered immune for the purposes of prosecution. We can anticipate, as I mentioned earlier, a pretty rigorous push for an ambitious 100-day agenda. And I'm going to stop here because that's a lot already. And I have no doubt that folks have questions and comments. But that's sort of big picture where we are. Lots of consternation about whether the Senate will be in a position to confirm some of his more controversial nominees, and happy to tell you about all the machinations happening in Washington.
Thank you so much, Marci. We're really lucky to have you on the call today. So thanks for just level setting with us. There is a comment in the chat from Lisa. I don't know if you can see it or read it, but she's asking about tax exempt status being stripped for certain organizations. And this is a specific question, but I think the spirit of it is, how do we stay aware or vigilant of policies we might consider dangerous or threatening? Does anybody have any comments on that? Or Marci, do you?
So a lot of the concerns about stripping not-for-profit status have actually come from charitable organizations that are actually churches. So I don't suspect that this would be pushed through as a major priority under a Trump administration. I haven't seen anything on this, and candidly, I'm reading kind of night and day. Which doesn't mean we don't have to pay attention. I can give you maybe at the end of this call a number of resources if you all are just interested in, hey, I just need to know the top 3 news sources to go to quickly understand what's happening in the healthcare space. I can tell you one that's very fast and very well done is Axios, which is a free service. But of course, the Kaiser Family Foundation has a daily news report that they share that I'm a big fan of. And if you're interested in sort of the detailed politics, although there's a subscription service, you can actually get Politico for free. That starts to get into partisan politics that may not be something that you're all interested in, but those would be 3 quick references that I would just name off the top of my head.
Great. Thank you.
And Stacy, I'll jump in just
please.
in a general response to that I think, and this is probably helpful for framing our conversation today as well. I think that one of the things that we learned in the first Trump administration was the style of the administration is fairly chaotic, and that can lead to a reactivity on interested parties' part, and we are an interested party for sure in the healthcare space. That is not healthy and unhelpful as well. So I think one of the things that I would encourage us as a community to think about is how do we engage without driving ourselves crazy,
Yeah.
right? Going through the roller coaster of the ups and downs of what happens on a day in, day out basis versus really focusing in on the really substantive steps or decisions or places where actual things are happening, right? That we need to stand up for or advocate for, et cetera. So I think that's one of the important steps we can take. We need to be in this for the long haul, and there's a certain level of resilience and strategy behind that, right? So I think, we want to be mindful, and that's one of the things that I hope we can get out of our conversation today is to hear from you all what your concerns are going forward, so you have a place to express those and we have a place to also receive those, and together we can hold space for one another on those over the next period of time. And then also it helps, I think, to outline specific areas where we may have concerns.
Mhm.
I know that, for example, in particular, with any change of administration, I would have this concern, but particularly this administration, what's going to happen with CMS funding and projects. So I know one of the things that I've heard quite a bit about is just efforts to privatize, or really more to push folks into Medicare Advantage plans, which if you have patients with Medicare Advantage plans, the pros and cons of that, right? Pros are they have some access to some additional services at times, and sometimes lower out-of-pocket costs, but they also have a bunch of prior authorization requirements that straight Medicare doesn't have, right? So that's an area that we can focus on specifically, right? And think about. I've concerned about Medicaid and Medicaid funding and what kind of liberties they will give states to do what they want to do with their Medicaid funding. Will they bring back work requirements, for example? So that's another concern on a state level that we can be mindful of and continue to advocate at this, at that level for things that make sense for our patients. And I obviously have concerns for those of you who are especially in border towns or in communities with high migrant populations, right? If any sort of deportation process at the scale that's recommended happens, there's huge health implications for that, right? For people left here, people transitioning, for children, for trauma, for community trauma, all that stuff. So those are areas to, I think, also be mindful of and be ready to address. And I think for integrated care specifically, I have concerns about some of the progress that we've made. I mean, we've made tremendous progress. Under the Biden administration is the first time that a president named integrated care in writing as a key part of their healthcare plan, right? Their approach to healthcare. They named it. That was the first time I've ever seen an administration do that. Will the change in the administrative structures in the civil service impact HRSA, SAMHSA, CMS, such that momentum is lost? And we have to do a lot of re-education. And we have to do a lot of re-advocacy work, right? That would set us back some. It would also potentially impact funding? Would health centers receive same amount of funding for expansion grants? Would the CCBHC initiative lose steam or be defunded? Right. So those are the very specific areas that I think we can direct our energy to and direct our worry and anxiety towards productively, as opposed to, I think, reacting to every little bit of, thing
Yeah.
that comes up, because that's not productive. And frankly, for my mental health and yours, not very helpful. So, yeah.
Thank you.
And in response, I think, Neftali, you have honed in on what the most troublesome health policies are and many of the things that are on Trump's agenda. For example, Medicare Advantage, he is very much interested in expanding Medicare Advantage plans, as well as loosening some of the more recent regulatory constraints that the Biden administration has put on MA. Medicaid, there is certainly a lot of fear about Medicaid being cut, but also a potential for block grants and a real concern about work requirements. Although, of course, you recall that although Medicaid is funded by the feds and the states, that the states really do call the shots on the policies for the most part. In terms of integrated behavioral health, I don't at this time expect the Trump administration to be super focused on some of the gains that we've made in the integrated behavioral space, additional codes, expanded use of different kinds of providers. But I would say expect the unexpected with RFK Jr. as the HHS incoming potential secretary. I think there's going to be a lot of focus on food and drugs and vaccines. But as you have no doubt heard, Dr. Mehmet Oz has been nominated to be the CMS administrator. And he is a physician. He is a smart physician with a lot of practical experience taking care of patients, but not as much running a large administration. And so I'd underscore Neftali's encouragement for us to stay focused on what we know to be working and beneficial for our patients and be sort of laser focused on protecting the gains that we've made. I think when we're concerned about all health policies, it makes it really hard for us to one, cope and to be impactful. And so I think, Neftali, with the conversations that you're going to be having under your leadership, figuring out where you really want to draw a line around, these are sort of sacred policies that we need to get very organized around and be protective of. That would be some advice that I would give you. And of course, always at the end of the day, the connections that you have to your local political leaders are the most important. Speaking for your constituencies, the patients that you take care of, but also your communities is always the most impactful thing that you can do in the advocacy space.
Yeah, and I would just add to that I think also having a spirit of possibility, because the flip side of an administration that brings in a lot of chaos and change is that there is actually a lot of possibility.
Yeah.
There are, and this is especially true at the local level. So federal government will signal certain things. And if the federal government's signaling, hey, we're allowing a lot of stuff, at the state level, they could take that and run with it. And if you have a relationship with folks at the state level, you then have an opportunity to potentially get some stuff done that you weren't able to get done before. Because the flip side of this issue that we're dealing with in healthcare is that healthcare is a behemoth. It takes a long time to change stuff in healthcare. We had actually one of the biggest transformations in healthcare during COVID by necessity, right? But think of all those things that shifted. It took a pandemic to shift those things, to shift us to telehealth, to shift stuff to sustained coding or billing for telehealth services. And a number of other practices that are related to the pandemic that we now just take for granted. But it takes a lot for things to change in healthcare. So we can see this from the negative side and be concerned about those things, but we can also recognize there's actually tremendous opportunity at this point. And a lot of that touch point is going to be at the state and local level. So getting connected with your state Medicaid office and building relationships there would be a great start for folks to have a lot of Medicaid in their populations. Connecting with your payers and building relationship with them. They're as uncertain as you are. Building those relationships become really, really important. Potentially connecting with your state insurance regulator. Like those folks have a lot of power in terms of, what insurance companies can do in your state. And obviously your local representatives, just even have meetings with your local representatives about what's important to the people in your community. Those meetings are really, really impactful in these sorts of moments. So there is a lot of possibility there.
Thank you. I want to invite forward others on the call that might have some questions or some things you might be seeing or anything that folks want to share why you joined today. Just want to leave some space for that.
Sure, I'll go.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Becky. I'm in Colorado. I'm in Frontier, Colorado. So despite that we landed blue, I definitely do not live in either side of the state is very red. The middle of Colorado's blue. I'm at LCSW and I run a behavioral health program for a small rural hospital. So we have a hospital in one town and 13 clinics, some in different towns. And so I run the outpatient behavioral health end of that. And so it was interesting when you were talking kind of about these pillars that have been addressed or that you guys are seeing kind of more in suburban areas. One of the outfalls I've seen a lot since a couple weeks ago is the environmental impact and whether it's farming and ag or forestry. And that's causing a lot of anxiety for people. So our Attorney General in Colorado actually has mobilized and is focusing on 4 different areas: immigration, environment. I can't even remember what the other 2 are, but anyway, like part of that is falling into that, which is great. So that's one thing I've just wanted to say. I wanted to comment on the environmental end because that's huge for people where I live. And secondly, what else is huge is I heard a lot more frustrated people after Biden was elected than this time around. So that's also very interesting to be in the wave of people who are standing in front of the grocery store and totally fired up about our new president. Because 4 years ago it was not this way at all. So I just want to say that where I live, there's a lot of happy people about this change. And
Yeah.
and I just have to manage myself.
Yeah, I think I hear that. I think there's probably folks on this call that maybe have a different opinion or feel differently about it. And I'm glad you're here. And I do want to share that our country has a long history of activism. We also have a long history of sort of demonizing folks that might be on Medicaid or on public assistance. These are not necessarily new concepts or topics. And what NAC is doing, if I could share that, this is the National Association of Community Health Centers. They came out with a response after the election, hoping to work with the new administration and really humanize people that are on Medicaid, right? I've been on Medicaid when I lost my job and my partner was in school. I know a lot of people that I've worked with, if we're LCSWs or therapists, a lot of people that we know personally have gotten this support and help. And I think it's important on the one-on-one level to let our friends and family know these are veterans, these are people in rural communities, these are children, right? And I know that when I lived and worked in a rural community, sometimes we would have a really difficult time helping patients get on Medicaid because of the stigma, right? And so I think where I would focus is on those one-on-one interactions and helping to sort of publicize, you know, this is a part of the playbook from LGBTQ and queer activism that I've also been a part of, where like coming out and visibility, it makes a difference, right? If you humanize people, it's harder to be like patients on Medicaid, immigrants, right? If you know who those folks are, and you're connected with them and you're helping them and working with them and you are them, that can really build bridges. So that's not necessarily a policy, right, commentary, but it's something I've been thinking a little bit about. And I just wanted to share that. Anyone else want to come off mute or join in or comment?
I would want to underscore the point that Becky is making about there being like real energy around some of these changes. I suggested that we can expect the unexpected, and I think that's absolutely the case. I think if there were one word to describe this change, it's disruption. And disruption can both be perceived as a negative, but also as a positive. I think anyone on this call is probably at least partly of the belief that we have a broken healthcare system and it needs some real fixing and change. And so Neftali's point about seeing this as an opportunity, I mean, I'll just tell you, for all the years that I've been in advocacy and working various elections and then the aftermath of elections, I do think the healthy perspective is to walk in the door knowing what you know, being an expert, advocating on behalf of the people that you care about, and not making assumptions about who these new policymakers are and what they might believe, because the fact of the matter is, this is incredibly complicated. And my point about integrated behavioral health, I just don't think that that is a controversial issue. And to the extent that it's well known, it's got a lot of bipartisan support. And so making assumptions about whether somebody likes it or doesn't like it, I like walking in the door and assuming that they're just as positive as I am, and starting from the space of what we're already aligned around.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think one of the things that struck me about what Neftali talked about, and I think Marci and others may have alluded to, I think there's a lot of local intelligence around things that are happening. And so it's easy to get caught up in the bigger wave of what's like the media headlines or like the clickbaits are that are occurring nationally. At the same time, there is a certain amount of local cultural intelligence that drives the work that we do. And learning to kind of rely on that would be at least one of the things that we're trying to do locally. I live in the Rio Grande Valley. We're along the U.S.-Mexico border. And one of the other spaces that I want to encourage us to hold also, as we humanize folks as to what Stacy said, what the other organization is doing. I think it's very relevant and essential. And part of that humanizing also is the reality that the people that are in that spectrum or in the Medicaid, Medicare world, they may also very well be very active Trump supporters, right? And part of our role as healthcare providers is to kind of hold that space for them, right? Humanizing means we accept them as they are without really wanting to change their fundamental core beliefs, even though we disagree, and we can hold a space to disagree as we care for these folks. One of the things that I've been thinking about, I don't know if this might be helpful for, but I'll just kind of share it because it's been on my mind for a couple of weeks, mainly related to this conversation. If you can kind of imagine kind of 3 concentric circles, with the internal circle being the smallest, and then there's a larger enveloping circle, and then a third circle. And I was thinking about the various levels of responding that's been occurring to the news and the concerns that we face as a community, especially in integrated care, and then maybe as a community in the areas that we live in. And so I think the innermost circle, I would call it like the most highly impacted circle, and folks in that circle might be, they have a very low threshold, they have a very low buffer for things, and it's very likely that people are likely to feel a sense of helplessness because the impact of some of these things now or in the future are direct, and they don't have the immediate capacity to bear the work of defending or articulating things as we need. And I just want to acknowledge that it's okay to be there. And if you are there, your task is to prioritize self-care and connection. Those are going to be your grounding or marching orders to kind of care for yourself, whether it's connecting with loved ones, therapists, or even a cat, as Marci referred to. That's what we need to do. The second circle, I would say, at least from reactions and other things that we hear, is, to me, is like the moderately impacted, or these are people with moderate threshold or moderate buffer, right? So that means there is a sense of anguish, they are near direct impact, but maybe not a sense of displacement. They can bear some of the work of defending and articulating, and then they can look for ways to support others while they need to prioritize a sense of self-management as they navigate these days or the things that are coming at us. And then like the third larger circle, I would say these are people who are impacted, but they actually have a high threshold and a high buffer. And they are people who share deep embodied concern for the welfare of others, but can personally be removed far enough from the fray that they can manage and be in a position of advocacy. In fact, they can defend and articulate. They can use their privileged position, skills, and psychological state of being kind of non-responsive or non-reactive to be responsive empathetically and care for those in the other circles. And these circles, in my mind, are not really static. Some of us could be in that inner circle at the beginning of the day and maybe find ourselves on the outer circles by the end of the day. Some of us may be starting off at the top and then kind of come down to the bottom, right? It's not static, it's not meant to be prescriptive, but the invitation really is to kind of see, can you locate yourself as you're responding to the various issues in your communities, in your clinic, in your health systems, and then do appropriate actions to care or advocate or self-manage, whatever it is that you're called to do. And, you know, there may be different things that are impacting where you are in any of those circles. It could be your sense of agency. It could be your power and privilege. It could be your personal and collective trauma history. It could be your internal defense systems that are very good or very weak, or your boundary management game. Or maybe it's a felt experience of what are your tangible supports your availability of safe spaces, whether that's internal or external, or do you have enough calibrated buffer systems in place, right? And so if you kind of think about where you are, I think that'll kind of help us think about our level of reactivity and responsiveness to the situation. I think as we hold the space, I think the space that we want to hold is like we are on that outer circle. We kind of want to defend and articulate and provide ways of making sense of things, while recognizing that many of us personally might be navigating and traveling between the different circles. So I just wanted to kind of put that as an offering or a lens to help us process things.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And as we sort of travel through all three rings, it's very helpful.
Deepu, I assure you, none of the lawyers or health executives I have ever talked to talk about rings or anything that is nearly as thoughtful and reflective. This is so refreshing for me. I feel better already.
Now it's part of our resiliency plan, right? In some sense, I think, as I've done personal reflection on this, it's just become more important for me to see actually more continuity than discontinuity in this. And because I think the framing of this is someone who feels very deeply about healthcare, especially healthcare for the poor, who spent most of my life in FQHCs with marginalized populations. It's very easy for me to go into triggered territory, right? And so then every article I read, everything that comes up on my feeds becomes an opportunity for an escalation of an internal escalation, which of course is terribly unhelpful, but very addictive somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And so I looked and said, well, what has changed actually? What has changed about us and about our commitments? Nothing. Nothing has changed about my commitments. And I know that nothing has changed in terms of CFHA's commitments and our commitment to our values, our core values, and our mission of promoting the integration of physical and behavioral health in the health system. So that hasn't changed. And it also hasn't changed that we have had an uphill battle, right? We have had an uphill battle this whole time. Healthcare is, as Marci said, has been a broken enterprise for decades at this point in our country. So that hasn't changed. The hill that we have to climb has changed. It's uncertain what the actual barriers and issues will be. And we have some potential concerns, especially around particular populations that we care for, right? So we're thinking of our migrant populations. We are thinking of our LGBTQ plus brothers and sisters. We're thinking about women. So we're thinking about each of these groups, and we have concerns about them, but we had concerns about them before too, right? It's just a different hill to climb. And seeing that continuity helps me. And then with Deepu's circles, Deepu shared those circles with me on a prior conversation. It's helpful just to also just give permission to yourself. Just be like, some days I'm in that inner circle and I'm not going to get out of that circle. I don't need to get myself out of that circle, right? I'm going to let other people fight for me today. And then some days we find ourselves with some of that energy and that resiliency, and we can be on that outer circle and be the ones to stand up and, do the hard work. And that's okay. That's all part of working through in a resilient fashion, all of these, pretty hard stuff.
Yeah. And part of resiliency is giving yourself permission to not put on an armor when you don't need to. it's kind of giving you the permission to feel everything that you're feeling and kind of taking in the despair while knowing that there's also another kind of journey that you have to take.
And I'd like to throw out a question to the group. We heard from Colorado. I know one of the things that I'm interested in from CFHA's standpoint is just hearing what you're hearing locally, because again, so much of this is going to go back to the local. That's the thing that, there's a saying in policy circles, all healthcare is local. It's really true. Like, most of the, in fact, most of the change, this may strike you as odd, but most of the change that has to happen at the federal level has already happened. Like, there's not a lot there, save universal healthcare, right? That would, specific to integrated care, make a huge, huge difference because healthcare is so local. It's managed at the state, and often at the payer level, right? So that's where so we need to hear, like, what are the implications you're hearing about? What are the things specific to your particular communities? If you are on the border, like Deepu and Lupita are, right? If you are in rural Montana, I'd love to hear, like, what people are hearing in terms of, again, either concerns or actually potentially even positives. Who knows?
Daniel, I see you come off mute. Did you want to share something?
Yeah, thank you. Wow, what great comments. I really appreciate the insight and the thoughtfulness that people are putting into this. And having been a physician in both the public and the private sector and FQHCs and in a variety of different spaces, I can appreciate how we're all, kind of what I've been thinking about is that we're in a form of PTSD, but it's pre-traumatic stress disorder. We're anticipating a lot about what's coming, and we can't really envision it right now. It could be on so many levels affecting us as we try to navigate through this. So one thought that I had is that this is such a supportive environment. Why don't we convene again and bring the observations about what we're seeing happening, and see how we can support each other as we're going through these changes. And it can help to build our strength and our resilience as we get a chance to learn from each other. And so that was the point I wanted to bring forward is that this is such a great group. Let's continue to do these convenings and learn from each other as we're experiencing this.
Absolutely. Anyone want to put something in the chat or come off mute in terms of Neftali's question, or anyone in rural communities, border towns? We'd love to hear from you.
Or folks that are working in women's health, folks working with LGBTQ plus populations. There's lots of different iterations of folks that might have interest.
And I'm also happy, not as a clinician, although I try to channel Harriet, but to the extent that you're hearing things and you want to know what is misinformation from what is maybe truly possible, because there really is such an information overload. So if there are technical questions that you have, I don't assume everybody is interested in what's happening inside the Beltway, but it's sensory overload.
There is a question in the chat, which is a good one, from Stephanie. How can we expect SAMHSA funding to be impacted?
Yeah, I'm a little worried about a lot of funding streams. Nothing's going to be impacted quickly. To Neftali's point, what has changed today from yesterday, but you have likely heard that President Trump made an announcement that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy have been tasked with creating a commission called the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. And they're claiming they're going to cut $2 trillion out of a $6.75 trillion budget. But you already have to set aside about 60% of the budget as untouchable. If you think about Trump said Medicare and Social Security wouldn't be touched. So that's about a third of the budget. It's very unlikely they would cut the Defense Department. So that's about 13% of the budget. Very unlikely they wouldn't pay down on our debt. That's 10% of the budget. So basically, I do believe that the commission, which isn't really a government department, despite the fact that it's being called that, but they will be looking at funding everywhere, which gets back to the question about SAMHSA. The extent to which there is a perception that things are inefficient or could be run better by the private sector, there will be quite the push to think about what sorts of services does government fund that the private sector might be able to do better. And I would argue for vulnerable populations that the private sector is rarely in a position to do better, mostly because there's not a market. This isn't profitable when you're taking care of vulnerable populations. But yeah, and I'm seeing a question about HRSA and the Department of Ed. Department of Ed definitely has a gun sight. I shouldn't use that analogy, certainly with clinicians, but the Department of Ed has long been a target of Republican ire because most education services are delivered through the state and local level. So there's this question of why do we need a federal Department of Education? Well, the Department of Education sends a lot of money to the states and again has those programs that protect vulnerable populations. So I suspect we will hear a lot about the Department of Ed, maybe not as much about HRSA. I think we on all sides of healthcare debates recognize that we have a real workforce shortage, a dire workforce shortage, doctors, nurses, certainly mental health providers. So HRSA is really sort of seen as the protector of the healthcare workforce. And so at this point, I haven't heard anything about HRSA being a target.
Any thoughts? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I can see the chat. So
okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So on the ACA, lots and lots of conversation about the Affordable Care Act. Of course, Trump tried, I believe it was 37 times to strike down the Affordable Care Act unsuccessfully. He has since said in this campaign that he won't get rid of the Affordable Care Act, but that he wants to make it better. I suspect that we will hear a lot about that. The first thing that's on the table for the ACA is that the subsidies that expanded services to a higher income population, so 400% of FPL, folks don't anticipate that Trump will support extending that subsidy. But the health insurance industry and the hospital industry will very much push for keeping that subsidy in place, because that's really been why we've been so successful, in addition to Medicaid expansion during COVID. So I think there will be lots of dialogue and folks should sort of get ready for that. There is also a push among Republicans to take the expansion populations in Medicaid and change the FMAP back to the original FMAP. So when they expanded Medicaid, they, and this is always the case, like my computer right now is saying, I'm going to shut down right now and add new programs. That's not going to happen, but I need you all to manifest that with me because I keep clicking no. But so the goal is that those expansion populations would have the same federal matching percentage, meaning there won't be as much as an incentive for states to continue offering services in those expansion populations. They've been willing to expand Medicaid because the feds picked up most of the cost. Again, none of these changes would happen quickly, but anticipating that I really like Daniel's point about not post-traumatic stress, but pre-traumatic stress. I mean, we're going to hear Medicaid all the time because there's a perception that Medicaid is inefficient and people ought to be working, all of the undeserving poor sort of rhetoric that we've heard for decades.
Thank you so much, Marci.
Sure. Oh, the gender affirming care, real issue. Actually, I suspect that to be an issue that happens quickly. So I work with the Federal Employee Health Benefits Plan, and they are very concerned that when Trump comes into office, he will advance executive orders that will be able to change gender affirming care very quickly. So what you often see is Medicare or Medicaid offer a set of services and the private sector follow suit. Sometimes what you see, and this is certainly the case in the Biden administration, they include benefits and services in the federal employee health benefits plan that the private sector follows. Well, we can anticipate targets being both gender affirming care, but also reproductive contraceptives, all kinds of services. I think we can expect to see some changes in, and that will happen more quickly than, say, changes to Medicaid.
I agree with that. I also remember during the first administration that there was an executive order around certain terminology like intersectionality, certain training topics, anti-racism, health equity stuff, on what language could and couldn't be used. That was really difficult for me during that time, and I'm sure some of you on the call are really involved in that. I think our next community conversation, we're going to be talking about DEI initiatives, so I'd love to have many of you there. But that's also an area that I might start thinking through. If that's an area of your work, how might you handle that?
And I can share some resources with you, Stacy,
that's
because
great.
In Project 2025, there is a lengthy list of, no more use of terms, getting rid of DEI programs, going so far as to insisting that federal contractors not have DEI programs, terminology, et cetera. So you are right about that executive order, and Trump will very likely, very early in his administration, look to change those.
Yeah.
And I think when I look ahead to what things could look like, I actually often look at some existing situations, because you have states that essentially operate in this environment already.
Yeah.
Right? So Texas is a really good example of it. And, and trust me, I'm not trying to take a toxic positivity approach to this, but what you see happen is that when the government essentially cedes its authority in an area, it says we're not going to fund this, right? Because that's really what the government can do. They can't say you can't do this by and large. They say you can't do it if you want our funding. That's sort of the way it works, right? So what happens is that then private organizations take on that mantle, whether it's foundations, individual payers, other groups that form together, conglomerates of interested parties form. And, you know, Texas has been a good example of this because Texas is very much a difficult environment for healthcare at large, but you have a fairly, comparative to other states, well-developed series of foundations and other folks who then try to pick up that mantle. Now, it's not ideal for sure, but that's really what's going to happen. It's not that like DEI work is all of a sudden going to stop. People are just going to get smart about it and say, all right, well, how do we do our DEI work, not calling it DEI, and figure out a way to fund it where it's not, you know, obviously not connected to federal funding, right? That's essentially what ends up happening as the government cedes its authority. It becomes much more of a local sort of effort to kind of hatch this up. This has happened in my state. So my wife was at a meeting the other day, cross-departmental meeting. One of the areas that's been cut because of the legislature's mandate over the university was basically like a DEI type group. It was actually called Health Equity. And so the plan is basically just to embed that work in all the other committees. You know, so you don't have a group anymore, but you still have the work going on in all these other committees. You're going to see more and more of that kind of reaction.
Yeah, that's great. That's good to know and hear on these conversations, tactical and practical ways that people are working, and what we're seeing. We are at time, right? We're going for 1 hour. Yes. So I just want to thank everybody for being on the call today and for joining us. Tanya's put the next community conversation in the chat. So would love to have you there. Like I said, we're going to be talking about DE&I initiatives, and hope to continue the conversation. Dr. Nielsen, I just really want to thank you so much for leading us today and all of your work. And I'm sending you good vibes with all the research and reading you have to do. Neftali, thank you so much, and everyone else that's joined us, and hope to see you all soon for the next conversation. Have a great Thanksgiving.
Thank you
Take
so
care
much.
of yourselves,
Stacy.
everyone. Stay strong.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.